I was a prosecutor in New York in the, for a number of years, but when the terrorist threat came to our shores in 1993, and I think because Islamist ideology first presented itself to us in the form of terrorism, the immediacy of the threat, the horrific nature of it, the stakes of the horrific stakes of the terrorist attack have really clouded our view of what it is that actually fuels the terrorist threat, which is Islamist ideology. And as it turns out, as we studied this over the years, Islamist ideology not only is the motivating force for terrorism, but also for a broader civilizational threat. We use the term civilizational threat because we're borrowing from the Muslim Brotherhood. Frank mentioned that the name of my second book was The Grand Jihad. That wasn't something that I came up with. That's actually drawn from an internal 1991 Muslim Brotherhood memorandum from the Brotherhood's leadership in the U.S. reporting to the Brotherhood's global leadership in Egypt about how they saw their work in the West. And they basically describe it as a grand jihad aimed at eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within by sabotage. That's their words, not mine. What I think has happened is that because the threat first came to us as terrorism, and because we wanted to believe, just like I wanted to believe, just like everybody in the Justice Department, and frankly everybody in the United States, I think, wanted to believe in 1993, that what we were confronted by in terms of terrorism was a fringe group of I don't even want to call them radicals, I think we wanted to call them lunatics, who had perverted a doctrine and basically lied about what it said in order to justify terrorism attacks. And therefore, we divorced the possibility that there was any nexus between Islamist ideology and terrorism, because Islamist ideology is undeniably drawn from Islamic doctrine. Now, I should premise all this by saying there are a variety of different interpretations of Muslim doctrine. And as a non-Muslim, it's not my place to say what is the true Islam, or even if there is a true Islam. I also think that we waste a lot of our time in the West grappling with that question, which is certainly of academic curiosity, but in terms of our national security strategy is sort of beside the point. Whether the people who follow Islamist ideology represent, say, 65% of the world's 1.4 billion Muslims, or 35%, or something in between, something slightly lower, slightly higher, the point is it is a mainstream ideology of Islam that is followed by, it's a construction of Islam that is followed by tens of millions of people. And that makes it a threat to us, whether it is the true Islam or not, whether it is representative of an accurate Islam or not. I'm not here to comment on or make a value judgment about its truth or falsity. My only concern is the national security of the United States. If they believe it, I need to deal with it, whether it's true or it's not true. We certainly, as a government, began in 1993 saying that what we had was an unrepresentative group that was committing horrific acts in the name of Islam, but we were quite insistent that they were not representative of any legitimate strain of Islam. And I guess when we started, I'm an Irish Catholic guy from the Bronx. I had about as much knowledge about Islam in 1993 as anybody with a reasonably good education in the United States, which is to say not a whole lot, just the headlines and not much else. So I had to delve into this just like everybody else did. And the immediate problem I had was, as the lead prosecutor in a big terrorism case, I had to get to the bottom of not only what people had done, but why they had done it. Because, unlike the politically correct things that are said in Washington and on the steps of a courthouse, in a courtroom where you have to prove a case to a jury, there's no political correctness. You actually have to level with them in a frank way about why people did what they did. Otherwise, normal people will not convict people of very serious crimes. The troubling thing to us, and I can give you two examples which really changed my thinking about this. One was that the blind sheikh, who was the leader of the terrorist cell that formed in New York in the late 80s and early 90s, we always had some concern, as you have in any criminal trial, that the lead defendant will testify. So it turned out that he didn't testify, but that didn't mean that I didn't have to get ready for him. So what we thought was, and certainly what I thought was, if what we're saying as a government is true, if these guys are lying about the ideology, I'm not stupid enough to think that with my background, I could get into a theology debate with a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence graduated from Al-Azhar University. But I did think that if what we were saying was true, there had to be 3 or 4 places that I could nail them, where I could say, you say the doctrine says this, but actually the doctrine says that. So we went to work on the blind sheikh, who is a very prolific speaker and writer, and scrubbed his books, scrubbed his speeches, scrubbed his sermons, scrubbed everything we had on him. And the problem we encountered was every place he said the doctrine says this, he wasn't lying. It actually said what he said it said. Now, to be fair, the doctrine also says a lot of other things, and you could make a criticism, I think, and people do make this criticism in good faith, that a number of the things that the doctrine also says need to be considered with the things he was quoting so that you get a more accurate context of it. Over the years, I've found that to be a less and less persuasive criticism. But my more narrow point is that what we were saying was not true. You could say that there are other provisions of Islamic doctrine that would soften some of the bellicose things that he said, but what you couldn't say was that what he was drawing on was not in there. It was. So that was one major revelation. And then the other one was, because we had such a long trial, it was a 10-month trial, or almost 10 months, we ended up having an extraordinarily long defense case, actually a longer defense case than most federal criminal trials take. And in the course of it, a number of Muslim people, authentically moderate Muslim people, came in to testify on behalf of various of the defendants. And I want to be clear about this. These were authentically moderate Muslim people. They would no more be involved in a terrorism attack than any of us in this room would. But in the course of that, every now and then, while they were being asked questions by the lawyers, some point of Islamic theory, Islamic ideology, Islamic doctrine would come up. And on at least 3 occasions, these perfectly moderate people who were sitting in the witness box, when they were asked a question like, what does jihad mean? Or some doctrine question like that, would say, I wouldn't be qualified to answer that question. You'd have to talk to somebody like him, and they would proceed to point to the homicidal maniac who was sitting in the corner of my courtroom as the lead defendant. Now, this didn't mean that any of them would commit terrorism because the sheikh ordered them to commit terrorism, but it did strike me that you had these perfectly moderate, decent, good people who would actually turn to someone like Sheikh Abdul Rahman as an authority figure on points of doctrine in their own belief system, and I found that to be frightening. And as you get more into this, you then have to think about a few other things. The blind sheikh, blind from about the age of 4, has every malady known to man. Bad ticker, diabetes, you name it, he's got it. He is of no use, ostensibly, to a terrorist organization. Can't build a bomb, can't carry out an attack, can't do an assassination, nothing like that. So how does he end up being the boss? How does he end up being the visionary? He ends up being that way because he is a renowned authority, a jurisprudent on sharia, which is the key doctrine. That's the sole and only authority that he has over a terrorist organization. And yet, he not only conducted the attacks or navigated the attack, orchestrated the attacks of the early 90s, Osama bin Laden has credited him with being the person who issued the fatwa, the Islamic edict that justified the 9/11 attacks. I stress this to you because I think we have to come to grips with the fact that ideology and the authority over ideology is the galvanizing force in this entire movement, which is not just a terrorist movement. It sees itself as a grassroots uprising, a mass movement to try to further Sharia. Speaking of which, we threw the word jihad around fairly liberally in the cases in the 90s. We continue to throw it around today. But it seems when you know, given the variety of things you hear about it, that we, even at this stage, 18 years after the Trade Center attack, a decade after 9/11, we still really don't know what jihad is. So some people on my side of the debate will tell you that jihad is always and everywhere about combat. It's always about violence. It's not about anything but violence. It's a military mission to further Islam. And then there are other people on the other side who are either Islamists themselves or apologists or even people in the intelligence community, people in the administration, who will tell you that no, that's an antiquated concept. Jihad is really the internal struggle to become a better person. And if you listen to them long enough, you'd start to think that jihad is something along the lines of remembering to brush after every meal. It's not any more threatening than that. Neither side has it completely accurate. Jihad is always and everywhere about the implementation and spreading of Sharia. In Islamic ideology, Sharia is deemed to be the necessary precondition to Islamicizing a society. You'll often hear people in the apologist camp say, look at what it says in the Quran. There can't be any compulsion in Islam. They won't force you to become a Muslim. They won't coerce you into accepting their religion. Well, that's true, but you need to look at the fine print. They will coerce you into accepting Sharia, which has very strict conditions about how non-Muslims are to live under the authority of the Islamic State. That's the way they're able to look you in the eye and say they're not going to force you to convert. Sharia doesn't force you to convert. It allows you to live as a non-Muslim under the authority of a Muslim state. But you have to be humiliated, because it says in the Quran that you have to feel yourself subdued, and you have to pay a tax. And you have to live under some very other adhesive conditions. And if you don't accept that, then you're in a state of war, and then your choice is either war or death. So that is what Sharia is about. When I say jihad is always about spreading Sharia, if you're under circumstances where it needs to be spread through violence, it will be spread through violence. If you're in a situation where the other side is ceding territory or ceding issues without the need for violence, they don't resort to violence. But the point is that it's always about trying to plant Sharia, because the mission ultimately is to Islamicize societies. And without that fundamental of Sharia, there is no hope of taking the next step of Islamicizing the society. So, when the people who talk about a military mission say what they say, they're quite right to say that jihad originally grew up as a violent concept. Islam was mostly spread by the sword, not by peaceful persuasion. But when you listen to the other side of the argument, when you listen to the apologists say internal struggle to become a better person, or the other thing they'll say in a collective way is a community struggle to rid itself of bad influences. You need to parse that in an Islamic sense. They don't really mean the internal struggle to become a better person. What they mean is the internal struggle to become a better Muslim, which means a better, more Sharia-compliant Muslim. That is not an objective, universal value concept. It's a strictly Islamic concept. When they talk about a neighborhood ridding itself of bad influences, what they mean is a neighborhood or a community ridding itself of non-Muslim influences. In other words, it's the individual duty and the collective duty to become a better, more Sharia-compliant Muslim, which is a very, very different concept. I mean, we'd love to think that we all have the same values and that we're all one common humanity and we all have the same ideas about what it means to be a better person or have a community that's rid of evil influences, but the fact is we don't see it all the same way. This is all a preface to trying to draw a distinction for you between flat-out terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like the Blind Sheikh's cell, and the broader threat that we're dealing with from the Muslim Brotherhood. An organization like Al-Qaeda is just a flat-out, blunt, extortionate terrorist organization. They want to bludgeon you into accepting Sharia. And they have a serious philosophical difference with the Muslim Brotherhood. They will not sit down and negotiate with any state or any government that is a target of their aggression, because they believe that the very act of sitting down and negotiating actually legitimizes the non-Muslim enemy, and that's something that's unacceptable to them, so they won't do it. The Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt in the 1920s, and was started by a very sophisticated, charismatic fellow by the name of Hassan al-Banna, has a very different approach, and it's a much more sophisticated approach. To the Muslim Brotherhood, terrorism is just one item on a very variegated menu. They will use anything at their disposal that advances the mission of implementing and spreading Sharia. They will also and be quite happy to not only sit down and negotiate with government, they actually want to bore inside of government, because being inside, having your hands on the wheel, actually does more to advance the mission than anything else does. One good way to understand what you're dealing with is to take Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who is probably the most influential Sunni cleric in the world, the leading jurisprudent of the Muslim Brotherhood. Right after the 9/11 attacks, Sheikh Qaradawi condemned the 9/11 attacks. And everybody, of course, went up in a balloon because he's a well-known Muslim Brotherhood figure and he's condemning the 9/11 attacks, and they say, how moderate, how wonderful, he's on our side. And then, a couple of years later, he issued a fatwa calling for the killing of American troops in Iraq. So you scratch your head and say, how do we resolve this contradiction? Well, it wouldn't be a difficult contradiction to resolve if we actually studied the ideology that we're dealing with. Iraq is a Muslim country. Under Sharia, Islamic law, it is the obligation of Muslims to drive out any non-Muslim forces that invade or occupy a Muslim country. And if terrorism is the only way available to do that, your obligation is terrorism. And that's the way it is. He was simply following Sharia. On the other hand, in the United States, we're not a Muslim country, so there's no obligation to attack us. It becomes a cost-benefit analysis. If you take a look at what's going on in the United States, from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective, they've got it pretty good here. They're doing a fabulous fundraising operation. They have managed to get millions of dollars for Hamas, for example, which actually is the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian branch. That's not me saying so, that's in their charter. They do great fundraising here. They're able to meet and plan here in a way that they wouldn't be able to in a lot of Islamic countries, particularly ones that are under authoritarian regimes that have banned the Brotherhood. They are able to pursue, because of our First Amendment, their agenda of trying to advance Sharia and implement it in our institutions, in our education system, in our legal system, where we now have, for example, a thriving Sharia finance industry in the United States. So from Sheikh Qaradawi's perspective, we have the movement has a lot of assets that it's deriving in the United States, and on the other side of the ledger, by attacking us, 2 Muslim countries were invaded and occupied, and all of the activities of the Islamist groups in the United States came under heightened scrutiny, which they hadn't had prior to 9/11. So on their cost-benefit analysis, it was a negative, and that was the reason that he condemned it. But understand, as I said, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian territories. They don't have a moral problem with terrorism. It's not that 9/11 was a morally wrong act as far as they're concerned. It was a counterproductive act. They will use terrorism where it advances the cause, and they will reject terrorism where the net effect of it is a negative for them. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. They have a campaign here, which they're trying to carry out, to spread Sharia through our institutions. They're willing in a non-Muslim country always to do it in an incremental strategy. If you don't think it can work here, just take a look at what's going on in Europe, because they said 10 years ago it wouldn't work there either. And the last point I want to make, because I realize I've already gone beyond my time, is the new argument that we're hearing is basically that there's no such thing as Sharia. It sort of reminds me of, 10 years ago there was no such thing as Jihad, now there's no such thing as Sharia, because there are multiple different interpretations of it. I think there's multiple different interpretations of it, the same way some of us lapsed Catholics might say there's multiple different interpretations of Catholicism. There actually is a doctrine of Catholicism, but some of us don't follow all of it. And I'm not saying that as something to be proud of. I'm just making a statement of fact. But when you don't follow a provision, that doesn't mean that the doctrine doesn't exist anymore. It just means that you have a rather eccentric way of following. Sharia has different interpretations, but the claim that it's not knowable or that it doesn't exist is preposterous. And that's why I brought along my one prop that I have here. This is a book that's available on Amazon. Anybody can get it. It's called Reliance of the Traveler. It is the ancient manual of Islamic law, of Sharia. And it calls itself the classic manual of Islamic sacred law. This is not a crackpot book. This is not, it has some provisions that we might regard as crackpot, but what I mean is it's not put out by a crackpot outfit. The English version of it that's circulated in the United States comes from the government of Saudi Arabia. If you open the beginning of it, it has a variety of different endorsements. And those endorsements come from a number of Muslim governments. It is also endorsed by Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is the seat of Islamic learning for, basically since the 9th or 10th century. When we talk about some of these influential figures, like the blind sheikh, like Qaradawi, like some of these other famous Islamic jurisprudence, they're generally speaking graduated out of Al-Azhar University. It would be, if there was a Muslim Vatican, it would be Al-Azhar University. And the other thing is, it's got an endorsement also from the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which happens to be a Muslim Brotherhood tentacle in the United States, formed by Muslim Brotherhood figures in the 1980s. It's probably one of the most important, influential Brotherhood entities that we deal with. And if you go through this book, it says what we say it says about Sharia. It says that jihad is a military mission to advance Islam. It indicates that apostasy is a capital offense. Homosexuality is a capital offense. Women have half the inheritance rights of men. Their testimony is worth half in court that of a man. It indicates that anything that sows discord among the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, is deemed to be apostasy, which, as I mentioned, is a capital offense. And truth is not a defense. So if you say things that put Islam in a bad light, or put the Prophet in a bad light, or do anything that would create divisions of opinion among Muslims, that is deemed to be a very serious offense, which under Sharia would be handled in a very severe way. So my only point to you in bringing this out is it gets a little tiresome after a while to be accused of making all this stuff up, but this is knowable, it's accessible, it exists, it is propagated by people who are deemed to be, and institutions and governments that are deemed to be legitimate, and it's real, and it's what they're trying to accomplish. Thank you.